All right, all right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today. Just want to double check. You can hear me okay? Nod your head. Great, great, great. Wonderful. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the value of podcasting. You're going to hear from podcast experts as they share the value of podcasting and why PR professionals should be pitching and including podcasts in their media plans. The experts will also share tips for executing your own podcast. All right. So one of the individuals we reached out to first was Eric Barnes. He is the CEO of the Daily Memphian, an online daily news source in Memphis that launched in September 2018. Additionally, for 9 years, he's hosted Behind the Headlines on WKNO, the local PBS station in Memphis. For more than a year, he's hosted the Extra podcast on the Daily Memphian, which focuses on the arts and culture. Barnes is also a part owner of a group of community newspapers in Tennessee, as well as the author of 4 novels, including The City Where We Once Lived. Up next, after Barnes, we're going to have Ina Esco. She's been in radio business for 2 decades. She has graced the microphone for media powerhouses such as Columbus, Citadel, and iHeartMedia. In January of 2018, Ina started the Verbally Effective podcast, which actually I've guest starred on, which is a topical interview style podcast that intersects arts, culture, and politics and entertainment. Each week, she is joined by a featured artist, entertainer, elected official, or young professional with roots in Memphis. Verbally Effective dives into each guest's personal journey to uncover the incredible stories fueling their purpose, the highs and lows of their pursuits, and how through their passion they are moving the culture forward. The Verbally Effective podcast received a huge honor this year by being invited to the showcase on the global podcast stage at the 2020 Southwest by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. Lastly, in 2019, Ina expanded her Ivy multimedia brand along with her co-host and producer, Sanaa Marie. She created a new podcast aimed towards empowering women. And then once we talk to Ina, we're going to go over to Miss Jessica, which is the Chief Brand Officer at the Epicenter, the Memphis region's nonprofit entrepreneurship hub. Jessica drives external brand and communication strategies and execution for the organization, including marketing initiatives, stakeholders, media relations, digital presence, and events. She also develops high-profile executive communication, presentations, and messagings for the Epicenter's president and CEO, and manages relationships with a wider range of economic development and philanthropy, government, corporate, and academic partners. In 2018, she coordinated partnerships and events as a central point of contact for Memphis Stop the Rise of the Rest Tour. More information about the Epicenter and its on all that it's due can be found at vitalepicentermemphis.org. So again, we're gonna hop right into it. Thank you guys, Ina, Eric, and Jessica for joining in with us today. And so I'm gonna begin basically allowing each individual to give us how they value podcasts for their organization and the ins and outs of the good and the bad that comes with hosting a podcast within the organization. So Eric with the Daily Memphian, I'm going to turn it over to you to share your thoughts on how the Daily Memphian utilizes podcasts.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks very much for having me and having all of us. So we launched our podcast, I think some months after we launched the Daily Memphian, just because time-wise, it took a little bit to get going. We do give or take about 8 podcasts. That obviously has changed given coronavirus. We're not doing as many sports podcasts. Although we did start back the Grizzlies podcast when they were making their kind of quasi playoff run. And everything has kind of shifted like it has for everybody in terms of what we do with podcasts. But give or take about 8 weekly podcasts, all hosted by various people within the organization. Chris Harrington does is part of doing the sports one. Jennifer Biggs, who writes food for us, does food-related interviews. Bill Dries, who's covers politics and government and works on Behind the Headlines with me. He does a politics podcast. So it's all done internally. Natalie Van Gundy, who I think is on here somewhere and can chime in and correct me when I say things wrong. She produces all of them. In normal times, we have a very, very informal studio space within our office. Right now we're doing them all remotely, obviously, and it's worked as well as could be. But when we started the Daily Memphian and we knew we were going to do podcasts, I had a board member say to me, oh, great podcast. Have you ever heard of this revisionist history? Malcolm Gladwell does. We should do that. So if you know what revisionist history is or what Malcolm Gladwell does, I mean, just start with the fact that they're about 45 minutes long and the production credits involve about 10 people. I mean, producers and associate producers and writers, and they are, you know, some of the most popular podcasts out there, but they involve interviews and there's music and there's, you know, all kinds of different, you know, historical information. They're incredible and I'm a huge fan of them. But they are probably the most involved, most highly produced kind of podcast that is out there. At the other end, I mean, we do mostly interview podcasts. And I think for anybody looking at thinking about this, I mean, you're either going to do a monologue with you or you and your co-host. You're either going to interview somebody or you're either going to do some very highly produced piece and tell a big story with lots of different elements. That Malcolm Gladwell type being one example. Mostly what 99% of what we do in any given week is an interview. So whether that's me interviewing somebody in normal times focused on arts and culture, but lately focused on, you know, coronavirus, or it's somebody interviewing, you know, Jennifer Biggs interviewing a chef, and it's all part and parcel of what we do in print, but it just gives us another way to kind of talk to and talk about the topics we cover at the Daily Memphian. I think early on, I think I felt like we really weren't getting as much traction as I would have liked, particularly with Chris Herron. The sports shows were doing great. My show, which we call the Extra Podcast, wasn't really getting what I felt like enough traction. And the funny thing was, right around that time where I actually kind of thought about whether I really should be spending time on it, my son, who is at that time was a senior in college, texted me out of the blue from California and said, hey, my buddy, you know, whoever, also a 20-something, loves your podcast and listens to it every week. And I thought, oh, all right, well, that gives me a little hope to keep going and that we are reaching maybe a different audience, right? Our paid subscription audience on the Daily Memphian schools skews older. And if you're not a podcast person, but you've got a 20-something or a teenager in your house or in your life, they are obsessed with podcasts. My daughter, who's a junior in college, I mean, that's where she gets most of her news and information. My son, again, the focus group of 2, but they're true of all their friends. They listen to podcasts of all types, shapes, and sizes for news, for entertainment. And so I do think that has been the podcast strategy for us, has helped us reach people we might not otherwise reach. Through the pandemic, you know, we've had to shift things around a bunch. What was going to be really an arts and culture podcast, it had been, I, you know, needed to use that time to do other stuff, everything from, you know, focusing on schools to some doctors and, you know, health professionals and so on, business impact of coronavirus. And some of those are the ones that have done really, really well. And I think all of our podcasts, by and large, have picked up in traction during the pandemic. I don't know if that's because people, you know, I think I saw something that NPR has seen a huge, you know, increase in the amount of podcast downloads they're seeing because people are kind of trapped at home. In our case, it could be that people are trapped at home. It could also be that we've seen this huge rush of traffic to the site broadly across all content. I mean, our traffic at one point doubled early in the pandemic. It's still probably up 50 to 75% from where it was. So it's hard to say exactly why we're getting more downloads on the podcast, but we are, and that's great. You know, and it does seem like we're getting traction with all of it. We've done some, I mean, again, partly because everybody is doing these, you know, damn Zoom calls. I don't mean this in a bad way, but, you know, we're all having to do these Zoom calls and we're all on these. I think it means that people are more forgiving and we could be a little bit more forgiving about sound quality. And, you know, we want it to sound good and you can hear everything, but we don't have the studio sound that we originally had. And we've just had to live with certain choices like that. That also meant that, you know, we're doing some of them. I do all of my podcasts as on video. So we stream them to YouTube just because, I don't know, I think it's a little bit of human contact. You don't have to listen to it that way, but you can get to the site and watch us talk, me and whatever guest I have. We've done a couple that were live where we live streamed right to the site. We took questions for Steve Threlkeld, Dr. Threlkeld from Baptist, who's an infectious disease expert. That went really well and had a lot of engagement on it. So we've tried to, you know, mix things up is my point. The other nice thing about the podcast for us is it allows us, you know, mostly we're doing news information about things outside, you know, that we cover at the Daily Memphian. But because maybe I'm the boss or whatever, I can kind of do whatever the heck I want in a given week. So we've actually been able to use the podcast to be a little bit self-promotional. And that's gone well too, because it's, I had at the 1 year anniversary, I had my friend and board chair and, essentially business partner in Daily Memphian, Andy Cates, came on, and we talked about how this whole thing came about, and people really responded well to that. And it was both interesting, because if you're wonky enough to like the Daily Memphian and want to know how it started, it was a good conversation. And we went back through the strange history of how it all came about. Keisha Whitaker here, who's I think is on this Zoom call, and who runs our community outreach program and connecting schools and other places with free access to the Daily Memphian. She came on when she started that program, and it was a way to talk about what she'd be doing and do outreach and let it be known that we were giving free access to schools and all kinds of community organizations. Same with when we hired a new executive editor, brought him on and kind of introduced him to listeners and to readers of the Daily Memphian. And so we've been able to selectively use the podcast to be self-promotional and tell our story, which has been good and has been well received. Again, the sports ones have kind of, other than the Grizzlies, we've kind of put the sports ones on hiatus during the coronavirus. Other ones, like the politics and food, obviously, because food is sort of, in restaurants, has just been the front lines of the business, the terrible economic impact of coronavirus. Those have done really well. Bill Dries has really picked up in terms of the various political people he's talking to, also because it's an election season. The other thing, for us is, why do we do podcasts? One big reason we're in this partnership with, and I won't dwell on it, but with Crosstown and the University of Memphis, that we're taking over what was WUMR, an all jazz station on the campus of U of M, and it's been rebranded and is launching in October as WYXR, which will be 80% music, volunteer DJs, and about 20% talk. Not just the Daily Memphian by any stretch. We're hopeful lots of different organizations are going to come on and do shows there. The Flyer, for instance, we're pretty sure they're going to be doing a weekly show, and Robert Gordon's going to be talking about music, maybe playing some music, but mostly talking about music. So about 20% talk, 80% music, and then news updates that Natalie Van Gundy will be leading for us. And all that will be podcasts. All the talk will also be podcasts on YXR. And so that'll be a work in progress, and we'll kind of reshape. We'll only bring over our food podcast and the podcast I do. We may eventually bring over Bill Dries' politics podcast. So we're always trying to find ways to get this content out there. I mean, that's the whole approach for us. And probably I should stop talking there and let Ina talk. And I can do questions obviously later. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
No, thank you. Thank you for all that great info. I have to say that when news organizations like yourself share content that I can listen to without having to be tempted to read it while I'm driving, anytime I can hit play, it will keep me from reading. And I'm addicted to learning something new, but if I know I can listen to it, it might save my life. So up next, we're gonna, and there was some questions that have come through, but we're going to come back to those questions and bring those back to you later on this webinar. And we're going to go to Ina Esco with Verbally Effective Podcast. I have to say, Ina was one of the local podcasts that I became instantly familiar with. And I was like, this podcast thing it's a thing. And PR professionals, like I have to say that I initially I'll say I was slow to believing in them and the power that they have and the importance that they have of getting information. So Ina, tell us about Verbally Effective and all that you do with your organization and the podcast that you have.
Yes, I want to just start off by saying thank you, Milton, for inviting me on this platform. I really appreciate it. And like Milton said, he's been a guest on Verbally Effective. I started Verbally Effective podcast in 2018. And the reason I started Verbally Effective, I had been in radio for 20 years. And, some of you radio folks, you only have so much time to do a talk break because we were a music format. So maybe a minute talk break. And I said, well, I want to do some interviews, talk to my program directors. Hey, I want to talk with so-and-so, some of the movers and shakers in Memphis. And programming was like, if they're not adding value to what we're promoting, that's not a good idea. So I had heard about podcasting. So I said, well, I'm going to start me a podcast. Came up with the name Verbally Effective because I like to run my mouth, and I like to do interviews. So I talked with a lot of the people that I have met in Memphis over the years, because I'm originally from Beaumont, Texas. But I met so many great people in Memphis that I had wanted to talk to and get their journeys communicated to the world. So reached out to a lot of people, and they agreed to come on my podcast. I would meet with my guests at iHeartMedia with the approval of programming. And my program director was like, you're doing this every week. You're serious about this podcast? I'm like, yeah, I'm not playing. So they started asking me, well, when are we going to be a guest on your podcast? So, I've interviewed the Devin Steels, Big Sue's, Bobby OJ's. And what Verbally Effective is all about is telling your unique story. And I think what makes Verbally Effective so unique is because the guest is very transparent with their journey. And I added a producer at the end of 2018 because it had gotten so overwhelming. So many people were contacting me about coming on the pod. And one of my guests that I had on the show, I asked her, would she consider being a producer, Sanaa Marie. Some of you may know Sanaa. She's a sociology professor at University of Memphis. And she was like, I would love to. So when I added Sanaa, that was a game changer because Verbally Effective had grew substantially. We began to do, extend the brand outside of podcasting. We had started to do networking events. We wanted to learn about our audience, who's listening to Verbally Effective and why. And let's meet other people out in Memphis that could possibly be a guest, right? So we started the networking events, learning about our audience. You do have analytics with podcasting. I initially started the Verbally Effective platform on SoundCloud. They give you, demographic information such as what region, what state, what city, age, but I wanted to dig deeper into who's listening to Verbally Effective. So I added a newer platform with Spreaker. They were my distribution site as well. So then we added the Spotify's of the world, iHeartMedia's, Google Play Music, more of the well-known platforms to Verbally Effective. And so Verbally Effective kept growing. Other than networking events, I said, I want to know who are the other podcasters in Memphis. So I said, well, so now let's create community in the city to learn about the other podcasters. Maybe they're doing things that we don't know about. Maybe we can, help with best practices and things of that nature. So we started an event called Podbox, where we just had an open call to all podcasters in Memphis. Hey, do you have a podcast? We want to learn about you. Are you interested in podcasting? This is a great way to network. So we started doing Podbox quarterly. And that was a big hit. It had grew so big, we had to start, having the event in a larger venue. Of course, that was pre-COVID, and COVID shook up everything. So like I said, I was interviewing the guests in the studio. In the process of Verbally Effective, I was laid off from my job at iHeartMedia, right? And so I was so happy I started Verbally Effective because I had, created a whole new platform for myself and really reinvented who I was because, I wasn't banking on iHeartMedia to keep me going. So I think that's important for all of you PR professionals. It's very important for you to build and maintain a positive image for your company, your brand, and it's really an extension of what you're trying to do. You can definitely control the narrative of your message through podcasting in audio form and visually, of course, with your YouTubes. Social media is definitely a game changer because you can definitely invest in advertising with social media. It will boost your posts. But you definitely have to be consistent in the podcasting game. If you're going to do a weekly podcast, do a weekly podcast. Don't just drop off from the face of the earth because people will forget about you and move on. So let's just say you wanted a break. I'm doing a weekly podcast, but Labor Day weekend, I'm not going to do one. I want to break with my family. Let your audience know that. Don't just not post. So communication, consistency, transparency is very important in podcasting. You can extend your brand in so many ways. So I told you about networking events. I told you about Podbox. I consistently have meetings with my producer on how can we expand our audience. I started talking with other radio stations. Hey, 88.5 for Shelby County Schools. I was like, are you interested in putting Verbally Effective on your radio station? That was a really quick meeting. I'm on 88.5 every Saturday morning with Verbally Effective, 10 a.m. So, you know, you really have to open your mouth and ask for what you want. And, you know, guests that I've had on the show, they're a great resource as well because they want to extend their brand just like you do. So I've been on a plethora of other people's podcasts. I had Boo Mitchell on my podcast, and I talked with Boo. I said, hey, I know you guys have an internet radio station over there. How about putting Verbally Effective on there? He was like, sure, let's do it. I mean, you know, you have to open your mouth, and what you're doing is extending your audience. More and more people are listening to your podcast. And I think it's so important for PR professionals because, you know, you guys have to keep up with the latest trends in the industry. You have to keep up with what competitors are doing. And having a podcast is just another avenue of doing just that. You know, you want to get your message out there. There are so many types of podcasts, and I focus on an interview style podcast because I have a knack for getting information out of people, connecting on a human level and getting their stories out. That's personally why I started Verbally Effective. However, I've started 2 other podcasts. Well, since COVID hit, I said, I'm going to do something with this entire coronavirus. And I started a podcast called I Pledge the Grind because I said so many people are not stopping their grind and their passion because of COVID-19. So, and what I did learn from the analytics of podcasting is people spend, unless they're interested in the guest or the topic of what you're talking about, people will tune out on podcasts. They will. They'll probably listen to the first 5-10 minutes, and if you're not talking about what they want to hear, they're out. So I said I want a shorter podcast because Verbally Effective is about 20 minutes to 60 minutes with my guests that I promote each week. So I said, well, I Pledge the Grind will be much shorter, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and it's straight to the point. We're talking about, you know, how was your grind prior to COVID? What changed? How are you being creative? Why do you continue to pledge the grind? So it's basically the same questions, but different guests on the podcast. I also created a Difficult Beauty podcast with my producer. So this is catered towards women, just talking about, you know, ladies, our issues that we have. And Sanaa and I are being very transparent about motherhood, about how we feel as women about the election this year. You know, any current events, Sanaa and I are talking about it, and that is weekly as well. So that goes back to your consistency. Consistency is key because so many people, although there are millions of podcasts out there, only a few of them survive. So that's important to know. Like Milton mentioned in the beginning, we were actually extended the invite to South by Southwest. We were so ready to represent Memphis, but hey, COVID hit and they canceled South by Southwest days before we were about to jump on that plane. We hated that, seriously. And so, of course, you know, many corporations with festivals and events, we're doing the virtual platform. So South by Southwest did a little piece of that, but not with podcasting. Also, I mentioned surveys. Surveys are so important. And I know as PR professionals, you guys probably put a lot of surveys out there to get data. And I thrive on data. I have a corporate background in marketing. And I like to send this information out because I want feedback from my audience, the people that support me, and it's very useful. Verbally Effective, we have launched merchandise. Our shirts sell like hotcakes. I mean, you know, internationally as well. So, you know, I know we're doing something right with gathering this data, with extending our platform. And, you know, as a PR professional, I believe that, you know, if you guys feel that you can tell a story verbally, on a platform, and you guys can practice it before you launch it, or, having ideas, I want to start a podcast, just sit down and write it out and talk it through. You guys can do it. And if you feel you can't do it, go on someone else's podcast. Come on my podcast, Verbally Effective. I have you as a guest. I'll walk you through the entire conversation, but you got to be transparent.
All right. Well, thank you for all the great information. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. And then we're going to go to Jessica, the Chief Brand Officer with Epicenter. Jessica, are you there?
I'm here.
All right. So tell us about the podcast that you guys have put together at Epicenter.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's so good to see so many of you fellow PR folks here in Memphis. I am offering a little bit of a different perspective because I'm in your shoes. I'm part of a nonprofit organization, and we have outsourced our podcast production to a partner. And so I can talk a little bit about that perspective and how that came about and works on a monthly basis. It's been a great partnership, and so thanks for having me on. I love podcasts as a consumer, so I love this topic. Let me tell you a little bit about our organization so you can see how this fits within our marketing strategy. Epicenter is a nonprofit entrepreneurship hub. So that really just means we're looking across Memphis and Shelby County and making sure that we have all the resources needed for people to start and launch and grow businesses here in the region. So we're looking at what's working and how we can scale those resources, but also maybe what we're missing, where are the gaps, what do we need more of? Really, that's in, capital, the money that it takes to start a business and access to that capital, the people and the talent and the mentorship, the technical assistance and programs needed, and then that surrounding network of communication and promotion and measurement of the impact of our entire ecosystem, which is really just the network of support in the region. And we don't do that by ourselves. We work with 40 or 50 partners locally and regionally. Many of you are actually on this call, so I see partners here. I see Ernest, we're originally an initiative of the Greater Memphis Chamber and spun out about 5 years ago. So we've been doing this work since 2014, 2015. And so in part of that communication and measurement aspect of what we do, we, again, like I said, we're a small nonprofit. We're a 2-person marketing team. And in looking at how we can really tell the stories of entrepreneurs, we saw a major gap, at least at the time, back in October 2018, in telling the stories of Black entrepreneurs and specifically Black women entrepreneurs. We weren't seeing a lot of those stories being lifted up. We knew there were lots of women, lots of Black women in the region who were building really successful businesses, and we didn't see those stories being told. And so really, we had partnered with a local podcast production house called Kadzukian, led by Larry Robinson. He's been in the business for a long time and has a media company here. It's a Black-owned company, and our president and CEO had been on a couple of his podcasts. And so really, we started talking to him about how can we really lift up the stories of Black entrepreneurs, of Black women? How can we inspire other people in Memphis to start businesses? Maybe they've been thinking about it and didn't know there was a whole network of resources here in the region to assist in that effort. How can we, tell the real stories of what it's like to be an entrepreneur, the successes, the pitfalls? You mentioned, some of those real stories. How are we going to tell those authentic stories? And so we started talking to Larry. We came up with the Grind Set podcast, which does just that. It's 2 times a month. We worked with him to really hire the most amazing hosts. We have Cynthia Daniels, who I'm sure you all know is the founder of Black Restaurant Week and just a powerhouse event company here in the region. She just hosted the Juneteenth Black Expo shopping experience recently in June. And so she really brings that authentic experience as an entrepreneur herself. And so she really is able to draw information out of our guests as someone who has started started a business. And then her co-host is Williams Brack, who is a vice president at Regions Bank and has just a depth of financial and banking and capital knowledge. And so the two of them together really offer really, strong perspectives as entrepreneurs, as a person who helps entrepreneurs. And together, all of us have been able to attract a lot of different kinds of business owners, different industries, different ages and stages of business. And as a podcast consumer myself, I love listening to podcasts. I mean, these are stories that are told from the entrepreneur's perspective. Like I said, why they started a business, what resources they've been able to gain here in Memphis and Shelby County, what pitfalls, lessons learned, what to watch out for, what they wish they would have known. And so they're just really interesting stories. Beyond that, I think the advantage to outsourcing this production is that Larry and his team at Kadzukian have all the technical expertise, but also equipment, studio. They know what works. They know how to, distribute the podcast on various platforms. They know how to measure that success and impact. They also are able to maintain the social media presence, and we coordinate all of that with them. But, we have presence on Facebook and Instagram, which is another channel to help promote, other channels to promote the podcast. And they maintain all of that. They're able to cross-promote Grindset on their other suite of podcasts. So that's been really helpful in reach. And prior to COVID, we were hosting a few live events. So we had live tapings in November and March. One was in conjunction with Black Restaurant Week. So we had a suite of restaurant owners down at Chef Tam's in the medical district. We had a set of startup founders in November at Epicenter. And that was a really great way to extend the reach of the content. But I think to Ina's point, taking that the podcast content itself, we can measure downloads and see that engagement, but it's also just great stories that then we can use as Epicenter through our channels. Kadzukian uses in their channels. Our hosts who have huge networks can use to promote the podcast. The business owners themselves have been able to use those podcasts to promote their companies. So we're getting, anecdotally, I mean, we measure a lot of what we do. We're still trying to figure out probably how to measure some of these connections, but it's been a great referral venue or a channel for Epicenter, because people will hear the podcast and say, oh, I didn't know that this whole network of resources was here. So we've had referrals come through the podcast, and business owners, have gotten new business because they've been on this podcast. So it's really, it's just exponential. There's the podcast episodes themselves. Again, they're 2 times a month. Which has been, our investment, but then it just has this bigger exponential reach, and it helps us tell the stories of these local entrepreneurs that are doing great things in Memphis. It helps inspire more Memphians and Shelby Countyans to take on that new venture, and then, hopefully folks outside of the Memphis region are hearing some of these episodes as well and understanding what's available to them here in Memphis. So it's been a great and really important piece of our marketing strategy. And again, lifting up voices that need to be heard, especially if we're trying to grow, a more equitable and a stronger economy. We've got to, invest in Black-owned businesses and Black-owned business stories. And so this has been a great piece of our strategy to do that. So I'll stop talking there, but.
Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you for all the great info. So it seems like you're one of those unique organizations that basically said, hey, it's easier for you to get your message out in a broader sense by creating your own platform to do so. Instead of having your PR team and yourself market out there, you basically have created a whole nother way of bringing awareness to your cause. So I really, really loved your perspective, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on there. And then I love, Ina, how you are telling the stories of, I have to say, from all three individuals, from Daily Memphian to the Epicenter to Esco, all three, I've learned so many things from just watching the content that all three of you guys put out there. So thank you for all that you do. We're going to go into some questions here. And so how should a PR professional, particularly Eric or Ina, how should we get on your podcast? How can we pitch our stories to you? What's the best way to go about that? What do you want to hear? What do you like to hear? What shouldn't we do?
Go ahead, Ina. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, if you wanted to pitch your story to me, we do have a website. We have a submit to be a guest button. But before you come to me, I want to let you know I need you to be transparent. That is our secret sauce for Verbally Effective, because people, when they listen to your story and when they see the visuals, people can tell if you're being authentic or not. I mean, I can read people pretty good, and I know other people can as well, especially kids, they can really read you, right? But, if you would like to pitch, towards Verbally Effective, A Difficult Beauty, or even I Pledge the Grind, I would want to know, for Verbally Effective, are you going to tell your story from beginning to end and include the challenges and triumphs, not just the good things? I want to know about everything, like how did you overcome difficulties, because people can relate to that type of information, especially when it's conveyed on a podcast. So being a podcaster since 2018, I've been able to really learn how to control the conversation to get from my guests what I need them to communicate. I guess that's why it's called Verbally Effective, but I'm definitely open to new guests on Verbally Effective. I pride myself in, I've had 133 guests so far, and we've had a pretty diverse pool of people, but I am wide open. So, hey, go to verballyeffective.com, submit to be a guest, and it's gonna ask you a few questions on your journey and if you're willing to be transparent. So that's how you can pitch to me.
Yeah, for us, for the podcast I do, you can just email me. I'll put it in the chat, but it's barnes@dailymemphian.com, and it's on the site. Or you can email Natalie Van Gundy, who's producer of all our podcasts. And, in our case, we'll sort of figure out, we always want to hear from people that might have a story to tell. It might be a good fit for The Extra. It might be a good fit for Bill's Politics podcast. It might be a good fit for Behind the Headlines. We do in normal times a series of seminars, that are focused on small business or women in business or commercial real estate. So we'd love to hear from you all, and just email me or Natalie, because Natalie also books the guests. Natalie put it in the chat, her email. And figure it out. The Extra podcast is meant, I say arts and culture, but that's really broadly defined. Culture can be kind of whatever we want it, or I want it to be on any given day. And we are very focused, and have tried to be always, but certainly since the Daily Memphian launched, to be diverse and to have more Black voices and faces and more women, and not, just the sort of, I say this as a white guy, parade of white guy faces. So that's hugely important to us, and would love to hear the stories of the people you guys work with and represent.
And Jessica, anything you want to add on how the organization, how should they reach out to you? What stories are you looking for?
Yeah, we really work together. Sometimes our guests come through Epicenter. It's someone we've worked with, or one of our partners has worked with. Sometimes it's through Kazukian. Often it's through Cynthia or Williams Brack. And so he goes by Brack, so I keep wanting to say his full name, but Brack. And so, we're pretty informal. We're always looking for small business owners and startups that are doing great things in Memphis. I'd say listen to the podcast episodes to kind of get the feel for that. And if you know someone who could talk about their journey, but also, right now, I mean, I think a lot of other entrepreneurs are looking for sort of resiliency stories and how people are navigating these current times. And so there's certainly a time angle, a timeliness angle right now that we're looking for, but we're always looking for great entrepreneurial stories. So, maybe not just for GrindSet, but in general.
Yeah. So we got some good questions coming in here, some additional ones. So James Barnes wrote, PR professionals typically use Cision and other qualification tools and software tools to verify the audience reach of the publications or journalists we're trying to reach out to. So is there a certain audible way or to verify the audience reach of your audiences? How do you track that information, and do you share that information with people that you're working with or that are pitching stories to you?
Well, I utilize the analytics that come from SoundCloud, which is one of my distribution networks. And I told you I've added Spreaker as well. And Spreaker is a great tool. It does analytics. However, Apple added a new feature, and Apple Podcasts, they continue to hone in on data. Like, that's a goal for them with Apple Podcasts. If you're on their platform, they're trying to dig into the numbers. So I do include that information, especially when I seek sponsors, because I include that information in the pack, because I want them to understand the amount of downloads, who we're reaching, what our demo is, to see if they're a good fit, and see if that we can align together with them as a sponsor for us. So yeah, there's ways to get into analytics, but that's also, I want to say, why a lot of people are on the fence about podcasting, because some people think that, those numbers cannot be fine-tuned and really nailed down with podcasting, because podcasting, it is new, but it's been out here for a second. And some people, big corporations, people at the top, they want to know, is the data real? Like, you can download a podcast, you can subscribe to a podcast, but if I download that podcast once, I can go back and listen to it as many times. Why isn't it not capturing as many times as someone listened? How many times do you really count it? So I think the industry with podcasting is still trying to fine-tune the data as well.
Yeah, we use Libsyn. I'll put the name. It's one of those in the chat. And the analytics are good, and it's very cost effective. We switched from a much more expensive platform and upgraded our service when we went to Libsyn. Natalie just put it in there. It's been great and gives you a lot of the analytics. There is some, I think Natalie, if she could be more articulate than me on this, but there's room for fudging in podcast analytics. Not that a publisher would ever fudge about numbers when selling ads or anything, but it because you get downloads, how much was it really listened to? We get a lot of, in our case, we're kind of an oddity where a lot of our stuff gets played directly from the site when it's embedded there. We also put some of the podcasts, mine particularly, we do on YouTube. So it's not going to be as exact a number as you might want, but I mean, you can get the gist of it, of about how many people and on what platforms they're listening. And again, Libsyn she put in there has been really great.
Yeah, I would just echo all of that. I mean, that's been our experience too. Obviously, we're relying on our partner to keep up with analytics and also the newest forms of measurement. And so, totally agree with what both of you said. And we are able to see the growth, in general of downloads. But that's also why we're looking at just a bigger picture in terms of the social engagement and referrals into Epicenter and engagement with new entrepreneurs and our hosts and our networks. And so we try to look at just, how that's been able to be leveraged across all of those channels to gauge success.
So we have a question from Brad with PRSA Southeast District Board. He says, when you first launched, how and where did you set the bar for success? Was there a minimum threshold for deciding if it was worth it or not?
Well, I'll start with when I first started, I had already had a following being a radio personality with iHeartMedia, so I knew I know people like to talk about themselves. First of all, I know that. And I was like, okay, these interviews are easy to get these people to come in. But, like I said, the key to Verbally Effective is the transparency. And I think that I have exceeded a lot of the goals that I set for myself, because I never imagined that I would be invited to South by Southwest Festival, like in year 2 of the podcast. And I never imagined I would partner with other platforms that would just put my podcast on their, platform. Because when I was working at iHeartMedia, I'll just share this with you guys. When I worked there, I talked with program, and I said, hey, can you add Verbally Effective on Saturday mornings at 8? And they was like, why would we do that? I'm like, what, are you serious? I was like, have you listened to it? It was a struggle at the company I was working with. But when I figured out, hey, I could get on the iHeart platform anyway. Like, I don't have to go through them, because I can go through it distribution wise, coming from a distribution aspect, it can just upload to iHeartMedia. But I was trying to get on K97 Saturday morning. That's what I wanted to do, because it's a Memphis rooted podcast. However, it all worked out. Yeah.
Okay. Jessica or Eric, anything to add to that on how you've gauged success in the beginning of starting your podcast?
I mean, we kind of obsess over the downloads, and I mean, that's, are we growing? I think that's what Jessica said well, was, there's some fuzziness in the data and the numbers, but is it generally trending upward? Are we getting the anecdotal feedback we want? The radio station will be a new measure for us, where we won't have really great analytics on it, but, there'll be a lot of word of mouth, frankly, that we'll be able to tell early on. Whether it's growing, whether it's gaining traction. So what we don't know is what should we really be expecting? I really don't know how many, what is full-blown success for the podcast going to look like? That to me is still a bit of a mystery.
Well, I agree. And I think, as an organization that serves entrepreneurs, we're also really entrepreneurial. So we have sort of a high risk tolerance, and we didn't know what to expect. We knew this was a gap in the market and in sort of local stories. And so we were like, let's try it. We knew Kadzukian had a proven track record. We talked to them a lot about their past experience and the different podcasts that they had and what their reach was. And we're really comfortable and excited about that. And so we took it on. And, when you hear sort of people send you emails and, hear feedback from folks, I mean, you just want to keep going. So yeah, I mean, I think we weren't sure what to expect, but have gotten lots of positive feedback consistently through, from entrepreneurs and from the business owners who are featured. So yeah, that's been successful.
Okay. Another question comes from Keisha Whitaker. Should monetization be a factor or considered when starting a podcast? So have you been able to monetize it? Is that important? Is that your goal? Tell us about it.
Well, it was definitely a goal for me. I did have to do my research quite naturally, like a lot of you would do when you start a podcast, and understanding that formula for monetization, because there is a formula for it. But I wanted to give myself some time to develop my podcast before I started monetizing, because, with anything new, you're really kind of testing the waters, right? And like I said, year 1, it had grown substantially. I had to add a producer to help out. And, like I said, when I added the producer, it was a game changer. We began monetizing immediately, seeking sponsorships. I have people running ads on my podcast. And it's things to think about too when you get advertisers, because, so many podcasts are only so long, right? So of course you got your pre-roll, your mid-roll. Do you really want to do a post-roll? You have to think of those things, especially with an election year, for example. Do you want a whole bunch of political ads running on your podcast? It's a lot of things to think about when you monetize and how you monetize. Verbally Effective not only does that with advertising, like I said, we seek sponsors as well that align with our podcast. So, it's definitely up to you, and you can definitely monetize your podcast. I mean, there are plenty of ways you can do that.
Ours is a little bit different. Obviously, as a nonprofit hub organization, we take on the role for the entire system, or roles for the entire system that maybe individual partners wouldn't be able to take on. So we were able to invest in this podcast on behalf of the entire community to tell these stories. And so our goals are not, revenue, but to really, again, raise awareness, to drive, interest in certain programs. We have, put the ads that we have inside the podcast are for specific programs that maybe we're trying to drive recruitment for, drive awareness of the resources in the ecosystem, and drive business to these entrepreneurs. So ours is, as a nonprofit, we don't have a goal to monetize the podcast, and are able to invest in that through our marketing budget. But those outcomes that we're hoping for, program recruitment, awareness, those are growing. So
we've sold, just briefly, we've sold some sponsorships of podcasting. We haven't honestly done as well with that as I would have liked. And I think going into our third year, we'll make more of a priority of that. All our podcasts are freely available. So in a way, that's a good thing in terms of just pure promotion and, getting the word out about the Daily Memphian, because we're still new. There's still people who kind of know who we are. We're kind of that place that Jeff Calkins went to, that sort of stuff. So, and most of our content in normal times is behind the paywall. So having a good dose of free content helps to balance that out. So it's been, I think, very good promotionally. And like I said, skewing younger to some extent in terms of the people we're reaching via the podcast versus, those who go and read articles with us.
Okay. Here's another question for you all. Comes from James Barnes. He says, what is your point of view regarding podcasters' adherence to journalistic principles of integrity versus entertainment?
Well, Mr. Barnes, there are, like I said, a plethora of podcasts out there. It depends on the type of podcast that you want to do. So, Verbally Effective is an interview style podcast that intersects art, culture, politics, and entertainment. So I can kind of straddle that line with Verbally Effective, but being in radio 20 years and communicating to the masses, I definitely do my research before my guests come on the show. I think that if you were trying to reach maybe more so of a niche audience with a more specific theme to your podcast, and definitely, I know Eric can speak from a news perspective, because that's what, they may focus on. You have to have some integrity with what you're communicating. So, it depends, to me, in my opinion, it depends on the type of podcast that you do.
Yeah, for us, we've got to have integrity with it. Now, what I'm doing in terms of, the one I host, it's lighter. It's meant to be very casual, but it's got to be accurate. And, I think we've had some situations where I said something that was not accurate. We had to take it out, so we didn't just have that living out there. I don't think I said anything terrible. It just, wasn't accurate about a number or something like that. Natalie can correct me in the chat. But I think particularly right now, local news is under assault. It's a disastrous business. There's all this sort of, we won't even have to get into the politics of fake news, but there's this distrust of the news that is just out there. And so I think, Ines said transparency. I think transparency is really important. If you're doing something that's just entertaining and that's great. And if you're making a point of view about advocating for X or Y, that's totally fine. But I think you do need to be honest about what you're doing and straightforward. And if you're presenting yourself as a journalistic entity, you got to hold yourself to the highest standards. If you're presenting your podcast as a promotional opportunity for whatever, you got to be clear about that, I think, or else people will see through it, or you're doing a disservice to the community.
All right. Well, we are 2 minutes. Oh, can you hear me? I have to make sure I wasn't on mute. but you can hear me. We are 2 minutes away from closing out the webinar today. Our speakers, any last words of wisdom that you want to give anyone that's thinking about creating a podcast? Any good, bad, or ugly, or pretty, or anything amazing or not that you want to share?
Well,
One thing. Go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say consistency is key. Like I said, when you launch your podcast, you have to determine how often you want to do your pod. So like I said, I do a weekly podcast. You have to be consistent in this podcast game because people will forget about you. Everyone is living digitally right now. A lot of people are at the house because of COVID. I mean, the opportunity is so great for you PR professionals. If you guys, have any questions, my producer and I, before COVID hit, we did a podcasting one-on-one workshop. It was awesome, and they were so surprised that we provided so much information for the price that we charge. But I'm willing to help any of you if you are interested in starting a podcast, if you're interested in being a guest. I did put my email within the chat, and International Podcast Day is coming up on September 30th. Reach out to me, guys, and follow me on social media at Ina Esco, because some other podcasters and I are doing a huge virtual event for International Podcast Day if you're interested in podcasting. And thank you, Milton. I love you, Milton.
Love you too. Any last words, Jessica or Eric?
You can't, I think a mistake I made is this, you can build it and they will come. You've got to promote it. You've got to, and I'm still not good about that for my podcast. I think we are, as an organization, getting smarter and smarter and better about how we promote and push people towards the podcast. But it's not enough just to build it and put it on the site and walk away. That's my word of wisdom.
Okay.
I would just add, there are lots of podcasts out there and a lot of content. So to start a new one, what gap are you filling? What is your unique perspective that you can bring? What's not being said? What problem are you solving? Think about how, just like everything else we do, how is this fitting in with the larger picture? How is it really helping accomplish your goals? And what unique perspective are you bringing to sort of stand out amid all the noise? And to both Ina and Eric's points, consistency and promotion and all the time promotion to grow your audience is really important. And so identifying how you're going to do that on the front end and then just pivot along the way would be my advice. But.
All right. Well, thank you, all three of you, for your time today and me bugging you over the last couple of weeks having this conversation so that we can share this with the PRSA Memphis chapter. I also want to give a thanks to the programming committee, Alicia and Terry, who helps me come up with programming and ideas each month. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. And keep in mind, you can find out more about PRSA. If you're not a member, we encourage you to join. You can go to prsamemphis.org, or you can go to PRSA Memphis on Facebook or LinkedIn. You can find us, Google us, you'll find us, and we'll teach you and show you how to become a member of this fabulous chapter. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.